I just want to welcome my co-host today. James, you're back in the studio?
I am back in the studio again. My fifth time, I think.
And we are trying, for everyone who's on audio, we're trying video. If you can't see us, then I got it wrong. If you can see us, I got it right. But we also have a guest here who we were introduced to from a fellow friend, Gary Stevens, who runs the History in the Bible podcast. And on the Putschcast today is Stephen Guerra. Hi, Steve.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for having me on. This is awesome. I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, and record is running, so let's hope we've got something to show for at the end of this program. Now, Gary focuses obviously on the Bible. He takes a look at, what's science, what's fiction, how much evidence is there, and how did the Bible come all together. And while listening to his podcast, I came across the History of the Papacy podcast, which you happen to be the host of. And I was wondering, first of all, can you tell us how you started a podcast about the papacy?
I started way back in 2013, just a little bit before Gary started, and I really liked the papacy and the popes and the Western Church because really that connects to everything. And I never really went out to have a podcast that would be about biographies of the popes. I like more stories, organizational structure, how all the pieces work together, more so than just bios of the popes.
And we are all about power struggles here and regime change. So that's usually through revolutions and revolts. Sometimes there are coups. And I reached out to you initially asking, thinking of the papacy, were there any coups in history? And do you remember what you suggested to me?
I think the Cadaver Synod was the first one that I suggested.
Have you ever heard of it before?
No, I knew nothing about it, but it sounded like something out of Game of Thrones.
First of all, Cadaver, we sort of all know what that is, I guess. But a synod, for the non-Catholics on Putschcast today, can you explain what a synod is?
All it really is an assembly or a meeting of bishops. It's almost like a parliament or a Congress, and there's different synods. So this one, they're using the synod more in the sense of a trial, but generally a synod is just a meeting of the bishops of a locality.
They're basically the power brokers of the Catholic Church.
If there's any problems or questions, anything administrative, that's what they'll use synods. And they have synods all the time. There's probably one of some sort going on right now as we speak. That's just the normal meeting mechanism, I guess you could call it, of within the Catholic Church. The Orthodox churches, Protestant churches might, like the Anglicans might call it something slightly different, but it's still generally the same gist.
Is a synod used in history a lot to put people on trial?
That's another way that this is unique, that they called a synod just to put somebody on trial, let alone to put a dead body on trial.
And Steve, I was just wondering if you could run us through briefly, like what actually happened with the Cadaver Synod.
The story goes back to maybe even as far back as 750, so about 250-ish years earlier, that there was a major break between Italy was conquered by the Byzantines, and the papacy was controlled by the Byzantines up until about 750, the Eastern Roman Empire. And after that, the papacy had kind of switched to being controlled by the Franks and Charlemagne. That was pretty much what was going on. But then, of course, Charlemagne, that all fell apart pretty soon after him.
And the map looked nothing like it does today, right? So Italy was fragmented. Northern or central Western Europe was the remnants of the Frankish Empire.
So Charlemagne had the whole thing that was more or less modern-day France, the stuff in between, and then modern-day Germany. Getting into this period, what it was more or less, and it was a fluid thing, but you had the East Franks that was more or less modern day Germany, the West Franks that was more or less modern day France, and then this center section that was called Lotharingia that went pretty much from the North Sea all the way to Italy at that point. And what had happened is one of the Frankish kings, one of the Pepins, Pepin III maybe, he gave the papacy a chunk of land. And then the papacy used a forgery called the Donation of Constantine, which they claimed was written in the 300s by Constantine, but it was a forgery clearly from about the 700s to take a claim to what would eventually become the Papal States, which was that center section of the Italian peninsula.
And Steve, just to sort of set the scene, like what type of role would the Catholic Church back then have played in the lives of just everyday people?
Was it actually called Catholic Church at the time? Because you just mentioned the Byzantines as well. So when did that split happen?
Well, at that point, the Byzantines or the Eastern Roman Empire and the Catholic Church were more or less still in communion. There is a little bit of a controversy in this story where they had a minor split, but the big split between the Eastern and the Western churches didn't happen until 1054. Which would have been 150-ish odd years after the Cadaver Synod. What the church would have played in an normal day is the person's life, it would have been everything, essentially. What the big difference would have been is that the Pope necessarily wouldn't have been what somebody considered as what we would consider maybe the Pope today, as this like all-encompassing absolute monarch figure. There's a good chance that if you lived more than a day or two's ride from Rome, you might not even know who the Pope even was necessarly.
The Vatican these days is the remnant of those papal states, which was a small province, I would say, right? Like it was big enough to be its own entity, and it obviously became smaller and smaller over the centuries. But I also obviously know that St. Peter's didn't exist in those days. So what was the residence of the Pope? Where was he? Where was the center of power?
St. Peter's, it did exist. It was in a different form as it was today, but even today, the official papal residence, it's called the Cathedra. That's where his bishop's throne is in St. John Lateran, which is on the other side of the Tiber, more in the historic center of Rome. They call it the historical center, where the Pantheon is and all of that. It's called St. John Lateran, and that's super old. That goes back to the Roman Empire. That's like his official throne.
What type of role would the Catholic Church play in everyday life? Like, not so much the people that were the main players, like the popes and the bishops, but like, was it a mainstay of sort of regular life?
I would say for most people that the church was central to their lives. Even a big chunk of their day-to-day lives rotated around the daily services. You get up and you go to matins early in the morning, and then you would go to vespers at night. Most people would do that if you were in close to a church. That's if you lived in a village or something where you could go to a church. Taking communion on Sundays, going to marriages and funerals, like every single thing would have been the feast days of the church. I mean, even a lot of the way serfs worked, they would get off certain feast days, and really everything would have had some connection to the church. When to farm, when to plant.
Yeah, a lot of those feast days, like even like public holidays now, are related to those days that were sort of in.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And James, you mentioned early on there was a range of popes. It's not like in today's day where you've got a pope for 10, 15 years or so. Back then, they had very short stints. Who's the one that we need to talk about today?
Well, there's two popes that are really key to this, and the first one is Formosus. He was the one who was put on trial, and then there's Stephen the Sixth, who's sometimes also called Stephen the Fifth. There was a kind of a controversy with the Stephens a little earlier on of whether one was actually a pope or not.
We'll learn about him in a minute. So, Formosus, that's a formidable name. Do you know what that stands for, Formosus?
I know I did hear what it meant, and I can't remember. I believe that was his birth name. A lot of popes would take a new name, but I'm pretty sure that was his birth name.
And he was the first, right? So it's
Yeah,
not like
at
the other
first
ones
and
who
only.
had the first and only. So no one ever named himself after Formosus.
I
wonder
don't believe
why.
so. Yeah.
So Formosus and Stephen, let's go with the sixth, okay? Should we agree on the sixth?
Yeah, that's the most common that they'll refer to him as the sixth.
What year we're talking about, and who was Formosus?
He came to rise to power. He was the bishop of a city called Porto, which, as the name might suggest, was the port of Rome. So it was a major important city for Rome, even going back all the way back to the Roman Empire times. And Formosus was the bishop of Porto, making him a pretty powerful guy, almost not quite maybe the second-hand man of the Pope, but within the top circle of bishops. And so what's interesting is at that time, it was not even unheard of. It was against the law, so to speak, for a bishop to be a bishop of one place and then become a bishop of another place. It was called, the technical term for it was called a translation. So if you were the bishop of X, Y, and Z city, you couldn't become bishop of Rome or anywhere else. And there was a lot of reasons for that. And one was that they didn't want people basically like shopping to get a better city to be bishop of, for, it kind of tamped down on corruption and greed sort of thing. That was what it was intended for. And that they really wanted somebody who was a bishop to be the leader of their particular flock and not somebody just looking for the better job. I'm sure everybody knows that type of person who they get a new job and then they're always looking for that better one. They didn't want people to be doing that.
Yeah.
But so what happened is that Formosus was sent as an envoy to the Bulgar Khan of Bulgaria before it was Bulgaria. And Bulgaria was really more so in Constantinople's bailiwick or sphere of influence. If the Byzantine emperors and the religious leaders in Constantinople were very frowning upon Rome sending an envoy to the Bulgars. But it just so happened that the Khan of the Bulgars and Formosus really got on together, and the Khan wanted Rome to appoint Formosus to be their bishop, which was a really big deal. Formosus wanted to be the bishop. The Khan wanted him to be the bishop, but Rome kind of dragged their feet on it because it was really unheard of to have somebody jump from one bishopric to another one. And they dragged their feet on it, and eventually the Khan just accepted a bishop from Constantinople, which made Constantinople happy. More or less made the powers that be in Rome happy because they didn't have to deal with this translation, even though they technically lost sort of a new franchise, you might say.
I was going to ask, is this why they have the Cyrillic alphabet and are Orthodox?
Yeah, 100%. It's because of that time.
Formosus not being accepted. This changed the fate of the Bulgarian nation.
It may have been fait accompli that the Bulgars were going to fall under Constantinople because it's so close. But who knows what could have happened if they could have turned into Latin Western Catholics. It's not outside of the realm of possibility.
So you couldn't hold them simultaneously, or you couldn't hold them...
No. Yeah.
Because that was the main issue, but you couldn't transition from one to the other either.
No, you couldn't hold two, and that would become a really big deal later on. Not so much in this story, but some bishops, especially in Western Europe, would try and hold 2 or 3 sees. That was like an absolute no-no. But even just job shopping or job jumping it was seriously frowned upon.
So presumably a lot of the popes were picked from these areas. How did they pick the Pope, and how, if they weren't allowed to transition other people that were already in a position to, like, the papacy?
Oftentimes the popes would be sort of the runner, the vice pope almost. They were called the archdeacon of Rome, and so they weren't a bishop. They were still a high-ranking clergy, and that's honestly that's the way that they got a lot of institutional knowledge too, because they were working in Rome with the Pope, with that whole organization, and so they were generally the ones groomed into being a pope. And even to this day, I don't believe it is a rule that you have to be a bishop to be a pope. Generally, they always are, but they could elect one of us, if or anybody who's Catholic, they can become elected the pope.
So they didn't need a particular education or training like these days. Even becoming a local priest takes quite a few years to get to that stage. So back then it was just anyone's guess, or?
Yeah, generally they would have been educated in their system, and some of them may have been sent off to maybe Constantinople to get more of an education, and they had schools and that sort of thing internally, but it wouldn't have been anywhere near as formalized as it is now, where somebody like Pope Leo, who was just elected, he went to the very certain schools, and there's very much a predictable path that somebody who's going to be the next pope would face. They had sort of a predictable path, but it would have been a very different path than today.
Yeah, so presumably it's probably like a lot of politicians. It's sort of like they're identified when they're younger, they've got talent, and then they're put on like the accepted pathway.
Everyone's obviously watched the 2024 film Conclave, and then ironically it happened shortly after that. Was there a conclave process in those days, or what was the actual appointment process of a pope in the deep dark ages?
This was a transition, and that's the conclave that we see today, and you would have seen in the movie. That's developed basically since even before the time we're talking about now. At this time period, it would have been sort of a hodgepodge, but it really would have boiled down to being in one of these synods where the top bishops would have met. I'd have to do a little digging. I know around this time, it would, and maybe a little bit earlier, they did allow certain nobles to vote in the conclave, and they did. I'm fairly certain they called it a conclave at this time. Generally, at this time, it's going to be the very top-ranking bishops, which they actually called cardinals. Even back then, they were the ones who were the original cardinals. They were either high-ranking bishops, high-ranking priests, or high-ranking deacons, and they more or less, they would have been the main power in electing a new pope. But you can really think about it, it's a small group of essentially noblemen who are electing the next pope. They just wear like fancy hats.
And so what would be, looking through the list of popes that you sent, I suppose if you were like an aspiring pope, what did they actually look for?
The election of the Bishop of Rome in a lot of ways was like small town politics, and the secular leaders might have been looking for somebody who was going to swing money and trade and all the things that the popes had a lot of control over. Even at that point, a lot of money flowed through the church. And who could control that? Who could control the appointment of bishops in Western Francia? Or who could control the appointment of bishops in Eastern Francia? Who could help, grease wheels of things going, goods and trade running through monasteries? Those were the things and just the power, the power of who's God behind is huge.
It almost sounds like a bit like a mafia don, like a godfather in some respects, right?
It's probably not too far from the truth.
Because what struck me is that I still got to get out of my head my 20th and 21st century thinking of this all-powerful, world-famous figure. When you said you can ride a day with your horse and then no one would know who you are. Because the Pope just didn't have the influence. Yes, there was so much politicking and power struggle around this office. And Formosus was obviously also keen to get that role. So back to our protagonist today with a very unfortunate ending. Who was he? What do we know about Formosus? And how did he get to this semi-powerful office?
So a lot of things you could really say about him is that he was a political animal. You really had to be a political animal. He was, from everything that I've seen, he was a good administrator. He had his faction and he was supportive of his faction. That's what essentially got him elected. He couldn't have been too bad of a guy if the Khan wanted him to be their bishop. The records aren't great from that time period. And one of the people who I leaned a lot on is a scholar named William S. Monroe. He essentially wrote the book on this. James, you've never heard of the Cadaver Synod. Almost anybody I've ever talked to, and before I had ever heard of the Cadaver Synod, I had no clue that this thing had ever happened. And it's really because of this one scholar, William S. Monroe, who he did the digging. And for 20 years, it's a really cool story. He found some records. He was the medieval librarian at Columbia University. And he slowly built a dissertation, a PhD dissertation on the Cadaver Synod. And after 20 years, he finally got around to defending it at Brown University and got his PhD. And as far as I know, he still just works, not just works, I'm sure it's a really cool job to work at the Columbia University Medieval Library.
Well, that's so recent. So basically, if I would have asked anyone in the 19th century, they wouldn't have any recollection of that historical event.
I think they would have known about it. There's a famous painting by Jean-Paul Laurent of the Cadaver Synod. The people would have known about it, but it was this one person, and I actually interviewed him on my podcast, and I emailed back and forth with him quite a bit.
Yeah.
And he's the first one who really put an academic look at the Cadaver Synod, and he really is the one who dug through and did the homework, so to speak, in a real modern historical way. And that was maybe going back 5 years ago, really. So it was within the last 25, 30 years that he's the one who really got on top of it. Any source you really look at, if you go and watch any other videos, but on there, he's probably going to be somewhere as one of the main sources.
What's the view of it now from the Catholic Church? What do they say on it? Is it something that they sort of cover over, or they talk about, or?
As far as I know, it's just still one of those things that people just don't know much about. And if they do talk about it, it's just like, wow, that's a crazy story. I think it's just too bizarre to put in a neat box.
But it's perfect for Putschcast. So I'm very happy that we get to talk about this today, because we are mainly interested in the power struggle, in the inner workings of a political system, and how change can sometimes happen very suddenly, brutally, and unexpectedly. So Formosus is our character today. He's the man. You called him a political animal. We just explained that he must have been very good at it. Otherwise, the Khan of the Bulgars, which was a very powerful entity at that time in Eastern Europe, wouldn't have asked him or to be appointed. However, we also learned from you that they weren't keen on that. You were not supposed to change offices because he was already the Bishop of Porto. So what then happened on his journey, and how did he actually end up becoming Pope with that track record?
So he did get elected Pope because he was popular amongst the bishops, and he was, for all intents and purposes, a stand-up guy. He did get translated, so he did go from one bishopric to the next, which was seen as scandalous, as going from the Bishop of Porto to the Bishop of Rome, but it kind of got papered over, and there's not a lot about that, of the inside baseball on that. But he did, more or less, by all accounts, was a pretty good pope. He was pope for about 5 years, made some reforms, nothing extraordinary, no scandal or anything like that, and then he died a natural death. And
So no,
that's about it. That's about it for him. And then he's buried like anybody else is, and
yeah, nothing to see here.
happily ever after.
And the reason why we're talking about him today is because what happened to him after his death. So he died of a natural cause. What was the year?
There's no other evidence to say of anything other than natural causes in April of 896. After Formosus died, there's a very short papacy of Boniface VI, and he's the second shortest papal reign of all time at just under 2 weeks. Maybe he was murdered by Stephen VI. Some say that he died of gout, but gout back then, I did a little research on that because you hear of so many people back then dying of gout, and gout sometimes they would say that somebody died of gout because they might say it's a disease. They thought of it as a disease of excess, that you drank too much, you partied too much, you ate too much. I'm not even 100% what gout is, to be quite honest. And thankfully, I've never had it. But
So James, there's a race to the bottom. So this is the number 2, the second shortest papacy in history.
So do you want to just briefly describe what Stephen VI decided to do to Formosus?
Formosus was more on the sides of the Lombards. Their center was around the town of Spoleto in southern Italy. These two factions, it's so convoluted, and you could go on for hours. People have done entire podcast series on these, Spoleto versus this versus that. But so Stephen was very much on the opposite, kind of the opposite side of Formosus. But so he was translated. Stephen, he's another one who had been translated. He was actually appointed to be bishop of this place, Agagni, which is another town near Rome, to be the bishop. But then he was translated, and that was still seen as a bit scandalous to have been translated. And really, the most we can say it about Stephen is he must have been absolutely mentally insane before, like, you could say that in the clinical sense, you could say that in any sense, that he was a stark raving lunatic, or he was crazy like a fox. I don't know. I mean, either one, it's really hard to pinpoint. He must have absolutely hated Formosus. And it could have been political, it could have been personal, it could have been all of the above.
Because the story is, and I was reading through it, and I was like, it definitely sounds like something out of Game of Thrones. Actually, even a bit more extreme for Game of Thrones, is that he dug out Formosus, he put him on trial, he had someone who was acting in his stead, and then he would question Formosus. And then after the trial was done, he decided to cut Formosus up a bit more just for good measure.
Yeah, so that's the craziest thing. There was 3 major charges against Formosus: perjury, which they never really exactly enumerated, that ambition and coveting the papacy. I mean, I guess Stephen would be guilty of that one, and then various other crimes. I mean, you want to talk about throwing this kitchen sink at somebody. And that's exactly what he did. You would describe that exactly. They took Formosus out of his grave, put him in his full papal attire, sat him in a chair. And I think that it's important to show, like, so I mentioned that Jean-Paul Arendt, they have he did a portrait of the Cadaver Synod in the 1800s, and it sort of portrays Formosus looking kind of like a skeleton. He was only dead about 4 to 6 months, and that's a very different look to you.
Hence the word cadaver.
Yeah, it's a very
and maggots, and not a nice look.
Do we know how long the actual trial lasted?
It would have been fairly short, and again, like, you got to a really funny point that Formosus wasn't appointed like a court-appointed attorney to represent him, or I'm not exactly sure what they call it in Australia, the solicitor or whatever who will defend you. He was supposed to defend himself through that deacon who was more or less, if you're watching on the video, he's like talking behind him as pretending he's Formosus.
Okay, can we just digest all that? Sorry. So
yeah.
So Formosus dies of a natural death. All good. However, someone holds a grudge. The someone who holds a grudge is called Stephen VI. Stephen VI is also an animal, but not a political animal. He's a real animal. Because he has some very sinister thoughts, and he wants to put someone on trial who actually wasn't as bad, to maybe make himself look better, or we don't know. We just don't know why he hated him so much that he had him exhumed many months after his death, put on a chair in his papal gown. And then, can you paint a picture for us here? So it was obviously a stinking, rotten corpse. First of all, how did they hold this up? Because I'm still wondering how that actually physically happened. If you know anything about it, please share. And then what? Stephen just stood opposite him and shouted at him. It's like, why did you do this and that? And then also, as I understand it, Stephen, you mentioned translation, which is changing offices basically, right? So he was doing the same thing, but he accused him, put him on trial for the very same thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And as far as, I mean, just to get your mind wrapped around, and not to be too gross, but it's not just Stephen, this deacon, and Formosus. It's a synod. It's all the reigning bishops, and they're presumably sitting there trying to pretend that this is normal, or I don't know what they could have possibly been thinking.
Yeah.
I think you could put yourself sort of in maybe the mindset of like, maybe you've been in a work meeting that's just absurd, and you sit there stone-faced and just pretend like, oh, this is, whatever, I'm going home at 5 and who cares? But I mean, this was a rotting human corpse that they're talking behind, answering questions, and you have somebody with screaming at this corpse. It's beyond imagination.
It almost seems like that would be a work meeting that I would be happy to attend. I mean, just for like the pure spectacle,
the novelty.
Yeah. I dug up my former boss. I'm like, yeah, let's talk.
Yeah. Oh man!
And I'm just interested, Stephen. Is this? I mean, obviously, it's pretty extreme to dig up your predecessor, but was it something like in the context of the time that people did?
As far as I know, it was never done. I know there was some examples. I believe there was some other examples more or less contemporaneous, but in basically like the whole swath of human history, there's very, very few examples of something like this. This is a unique event, and it wasn't like there was some precedence for it to say, oh yeah, we've done this plenty of times, let's go for it. This was highly, highly unusual. So much so, not to skip ahead, but the one interesting thing is that there actually was, in Latin they call them acta, or acta, probably more like it, acts. A synod will always have sort of the minutes of it, and the minutes actually survived after this, but it was so horrible, a later synod demanded that they be burned, basically, almost like to just, we got to get rid of this, and we'll never speak of this again.
That would have been my next question. Do we know anything? What was in the minutes? What was actually his defense? What was Formosus' defense? Or did he just plead guilty immediately?
The only thing they really know about the minutes is that a later council, the Council of Ravenna, that happened a year or two later, that repudiated all of this, mentions the acts and quotes the acts, but then they insisted that the acts be burned, I think just because they must have been realizing, sitting like, holy smokes, what happened here, guys?
And I suppose it brings into question like the other bishops, like what were they doing, like what were they thinking, and like how would you think that someone might be like, hold on, isn't this a bit far?
I think that maybe there was, or maybe the way Stephen set it up, that they felt they couldn't. I mean, there could have been some threat of violence because there was the secular military was in the secular leadership, but I just don't know. I mean, if we had those acts, that would have just be incredible. Maybe just by force of will, he kept them all in line. There's no real good answer to that.
I'd like to play devil's advocate now. So, Stephen, let's give him a benefit of a doubt. This is still the Catholic Church we're talking about, yeah? This is the religion of love and kindness and all that. Now, and we should probably dial in Gary Stevens from the History of the Bible podcast. You could probably give us an answer, but maybe you have one too, because I know you're prepared for this. Is there any biblical evidence or precedents, maybe even the Old Testament as well, that this was done, that Stephen could have referred to and say, hang on, actually, as John said in whatever, is there any evidence or historic example?
I don't think there would have been an example enough to say that this is normal. I mean, there's one interesting one is, I think it's in the book of Samuel, and Gary can correct me on this, where the King Saul used a medium or a witch to bring back Samuel from the dead, but that still wasn't like dragging him out of his tomb. And I just don't see in any way, shape, or form that this, I mean, I just cannot see that there was enough precedent or anything of that to say, yeah, this is totally normal. Let's just do this. I cannot imagine, because it's so far out of left field.
It's quite inventive in a sort of a macabre way.
And I never thought of the whole bringing back the dead.
Yeah.
I never thought of that part. Maybe Stephen was very fond of him, wanted to see him once more.
Yeah.
In a different way. Okay, we're making fun of the dead here. But anyway, so there was a room full of the most powerful people in the land at the time. Everyone nodded along, which means Stephen must have been an autocrat. He must have been a very strong ruler that no one dared to question or challenge. I think that's the political lesson we take from here. And then we don't know exactly what was said because the evidence was burned. Wonder why. And again, for many, many centuries, never spoken about. But then what was the outcome? So what happened?
So the charges were perjury, ambition and coveting the papacy, which, again, what does that mean? And then various other crimes. Of course, he was convicted. I mean, big shock there. And so what happened is that the three fingers, so on a bishop, they used three fingers to give a blessing. And they cut off those three fingers. And there's a lot of reasons symbolically why they would have done that. So, yeah, he can never give a blessing. Also, that those fingers may have been concerned that those would become relics, things that people would want to venerate or remember Formosus by. And so they wanted those out of the picture. So he was condemned and excommunicated. Not that I don't know what that really would have mattered at that point, but what that would matter at that point was that being stripped of all of his papal vestments, having those fingers cut off, what happened was, and what a practical outcome of that was, they had banished all of the pro-Formosus clergy. Formosus himself was tossed into the Tiber River, and that's a cultural thing that Romans had done since Rome was a village, is you would throw things symbolically into the Tiber River. And they did that to Formosus. Supposedly, he was fished out of the river by a shepherd or something and reburied, but that could be legend. All of the bishops who were appointed by Formosus were unconsecrated, which was very convenient for Stephen, because if you recall earlier, Stephen was appointed by Formosus. Now, because his bishop to that small Italian town was no longer valid, suddenly he hasn't done a translation anymore. So that's something that he can't be accused of having a translation. It's a very technical outcome because he was never the bishop of Agagni in the first place.
Good old Stephen, stickler for the rules, huh? Like he's very precise when it comes to
process driven.
Yes.
Which, I mean, there's got to be a million and other ways to game the system to make that work besides what he did. But hey, I mean, you got to do what you got to do.
And I assume it all comes down to corruption as well, right? So there would have been a vested interests by various power brokers to get certain new bishops appointed, and all those vacancies that now were available.
Yeah, it's a win-win for sure.
And what happened to, I suppose, after this occurred?
Stephen was murdered, and he was the first pope to actually be murdered or assassinated. I can't imagine why, but and he couldn't have made any enemies along the way, could he have? The next pope after Stephen, he overturned the entire Cadaver Synod, reinstated all of Formosus's appointments, all of his proclamations, cleared Formosus's name. But then this kind of was a back and forth over the next few popes. That after that, a pope who was against Formosus would go and put all of it back in again.
What was with him? There must have been. Where's the smoking gun here? Like Formosus, he's such a divisive figure. Literally, people love or hate him. They reincarnate him.
They're digging him up from the grave.
Yeah. And some want to deify him. So it's like, we need to find out what actually, he must have done something.
And really, the end of the end with that is that council in Ravenna in northern Italy, which you would never think that a council outside of Rome would have a direct impact on the Pope of Rome, but that's just how things worked back then. They said that, nope, this is over. This was all wrong. They made a rule that you can't dig up someone and put a dead corpse on trial. You ever see it? What do they say? Like, every law that's on the books, even the most absurd ones, it's because somebody actually did it. And that's
a good point. Yeah.
Sort of like a macabre Weekend at Bernie's type of thing.
It's really, I mean, yeah. It's the medieval Weekend at Bernie's.
But yeah, what was the people's reactions? Is there any sources saying about, or even internationally, like from other courts, from how did Constantinople respond to this? Like, was there any other feedback on this horrific event?
I have to imagine the people, I mean, that must have been the spectacle of a lifetime. I mean, that's a time where people are the entertainment was hangings and that sort of thing. I mean, that must have, and Rome was essentially a small village by that point that was really clustered around these church buildings. I think you could probably maybe see that people were terrified of it and just wanted to lay low, or it was like the party of the year going on. I think you could see it either way. There probably wasn't just everything was going normally. I think that it was either people were terrified or it was just like everybody was waiting outside of the cathedral wanting to hear what had gone on.
So would you say that, like, in the history of the Catholic Church, this would be a pivotal moment in terms of you don't dig up like your predecessor, but I suppose they'd never done that before, or is it just a sort of another sort of blip in the road of a fairly sort of scandal-laden trail?
I'm going to sound like my teenage daughter here. I think it was a low-key pivotal event. It's a pivotal event that is really lying under the surface because a lot of things happened after that were more or less a direct result of the Cadaver Synod and kind of the craziness that had led up to it. One of the things is the time after about the 60-ish years after the Cadaver Synod. It's a time called in Latin, the Saeculum Obscurum. That's literally the Dark Ages. They called it the Dark Ages of the papacy, or they also called it the pornocracy of the papacy, because this is a time, like everybody talks about the Borgia popes and the Renaissance popes. This is a time period where these popes did things that would have made them blush. It was so bad. And what really came out of that is out of this terrible period that lasted into the 960s, 970s, was a huge amount of reform. Two of the reforms, one's maybe not so an everyday one. It's called the Cluniac reforms, and that came from a monastery called Cluny that really completely reformed the way that Western monasticism worked, which was a really big deal without getting into too many details. And then something called the Gregorian reforms would come out of that time, and it was really a major reform of how the clergy operated morally and financially. So I think they really came out of this period realizing that some major house cleaning needed to happen. Not too long after this, you see things like the Normans come along. This is that end of the early part of the Middle Ages where things were very difficult, and Europe starting to claw its way back out again, going into the early part of the High Middle Ages, where, I mean, you said the Crusades are obviously a bad thing, but they really were an uptick for Western Europe, that wealth was starting to come back in. There was some degree of stability because the knights weren't fighting in Europe, they were fighting abroad. The crops were starting to grow. There was a temperature upswing. So things were generally on the upswing after this time, but you could call that period really rock bottom.
Do you think at any point, because it does actually, the more you talk, it just sounds like a sort of a mafia, they were able to justify any of their actions sort of biblically, theologically, or with any kind of reference to Christianity? Because it doesn't even sound like Christianity is part of the picture at this point.
I don't think it really was. I'm sure I could picture Stephen maybe in the vaguest terms, using Christianity as his tool or even his weapon, but I don't see how they could have. I mean, you can come up with a justification for anything from anything, but I think the people who were maybe thinking in a more Christian mindset were those popes who came later, and that Council of Ravenna, and then those later on reformers who are saying, like, this is dramatically wrong and we have to fix what's going on here.
After learning about all this today from you, Stephen, and listening to more of your episodes, I can't believe we still have a Catholic Church. I can't believe we actually still have a Vatican. I can't believe they made it through that. Like, just looking at the change of leadership, and how they changed, obviously. No elections involved. It was usually poison or knives or whatever was available. And this it wasn't a period. We're talking centuries of instability, of constant infighting, literally backstabbing. Simultaneously, from what I remember, the Eastern Roman Empire is still thriving in those days, right? It's still the pinnacle of civilization, really, at the time in Europe. And yet they made it through all that chaos. As an expert on the papacy, was there a time that even maybe the Catholic Church these days looks back at the pinnacle of their power? Because you talked about, and when we think about the papacy, I really couldn't tell you when I think was the strongest point, because around the Renaissance time, there was in decline again, and there was so much corruption, and therefore Reformation occurred. But maybe before that, maybe the Crusades, was there a time when the Catholic Church was in its peak, the most powerful, from a powerful point of view?
It's kind of interesting because from my, real survey of almost 2,000-year-old institution, you can see a lot more points where it was on its back heels than you can see where it was triumphant, really. There was a lot of down points. I think that the time period of the Renaissance really was one of the peaks, just because it was wealthiest at that. It was so wealthy, and so much money was flowing through the church, through Europe as well as from the New World, that that massive increase in wealth and in converts was even in the time period of the just after the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther, where so much of Europe split with the Catholic Church, it was still riding high. And even in that time period, there was still major reform movements as well. The papacy, this is a little known fact, and I certainly didn't know it. The papacy was almost done in the French Revolution. One of the popes was arrested, and there was really no plan or even ability to have a conclave as a new pope, and they were able to cobble something together, but that could have very been an ending point. And then during the Risorgimento in the 1860s, when during Italian unification, that could have been another time period where the papacy, as we think of it, could have disappeared.
I mean, I don't know a great deal about the Catholic Church, but I do know that there's a fair amount of scandal. And I just wonder how much this has sort of followed through in the organization.
It's been dark enough, but we'll get a little darker with like the current abuse scandal. I don't know how far you want to go down that rabbit hole, but I think that scandal maybe exposed something very dark in the church that maybe not to the level and to the real extreme corruption of that time period during the Cadaver Synod, but I think that, and it's going to force the church, and it is forcing them in a lot of ways. How much they're doing, I don't keep up with the modern papacy as much, but I, just being as somebody who's around and observing it, they're going to have to figure out a way to deal with that and do some degree of reform that directly addresses that particular scandal.
I always thought I knew a bit about history, but I always thought that from Jesus, Peter, and as it then developed, Rome became the center, that it was a linear development, and it just got worse over time, and its peak was the Reformation, when people had enough because the decadence and the double standards, the hypocrisy just gone so much out of control that the Reformation had to occur. What I take away from today, James, is that it wasn't linear at all. There was actually worse periods before. There were periods where there was much more abuse and violence. And again, if you put your own predecessor as a cadaver on trial, can you imagine what else those people would have done? And then what I'm also thinking, because Europe at the time wasn't Christian at all at this stage, right? It was still the East, the North was all pagan still, right? So the Scandinavia was still pagan. The Eastern, again, we talked about the Bulgarians joining Christianity, the Serbs, the Magyars were coming in. They were all pagans considered by the Catholic Church. And then you hear those stories. Imagine you're one of those rulers somewhere in the steppes, and they call you a pagan and uncivilized human being, and then you hear what they do. It's like, maybe I'll stick to my faith.
Like the fact that it's been going for so long and it is mired in so much scandal and corruption and everything else in between, that it is still a fairly prominent, the papacy and the Pope is still a fairly prominent thing in many people's lives.
And what I think so exciting about that time period, that is the time period, like you said, that there was large swaths of Europe that weren't Christian, yet they were coming in, some voluntarily, like the Rus in Russia would voluntarily come in at that time. The Bulgarians voluntarily came in, some less so, like the Saxons. but then the Normans and the Vikings, they're all coming into Christianity. And it's really to plug into this network that the Catholic Church and Christianity in general at that time, that they had really started to try to plug back in these institutions that had collapsed during the Roman Empire, and they were certainly less perfect than they were in the Roman Empire. But Christianity was really one of the ways to come into that system. And maybe honestly, because of all of that corruption and all, that's where the money is. That's like, to go back to your mafia metaphor, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is.
Yeah. Incredible. Now, Steve, at the end, we've got a few questions, but one is let's learn a bit about your podcast and why people should listen to it, because I think it's worthwhile. So I think we got a rough idea of what the topic is, but tell us a bit more about your podcast.
So my podcast, the History of the Papacy podcast, I take more of a thematic approach. So I'll take one time period in history, and sometimes it's as short as a few years to maybe a century, and I'll just go and dive in and take a look at all these different aspects and how do the people affect the institutions. That's really the thing that I'm interested in, and that's what I love to see. And I also, one of the things that I really love to see is what are the little stories like this that maybe somebody's never heard of, and it's like, wow, that one little takeaway, I think, is what I'm really looking for, is what's that one or two really cool stories. I want to just tell a fun story.
And Steve, do you have a favorite pope?
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking, somebody asked me this, and he asked me it in the way of, what pope would you want to have dinner with? And there's a pope, he's named Pius IX. He lived in the 1860s during the Italian unification, when the papal state, what was left of it, was completely wiped out by Garibaldi. He was known not to be one of the intellectually the sharpest knife in the drawer, but he was just an absolute larger than life character, and he knew how to play the situation perfectly, where he took something that could have been a complete disaster, and he's really the author of the Catholic Church that we think of it today, as the Pope being an influencer and the Pope being sort of a cult of personality. He was the first Pope to be photographed, and that's where people had a picture of the Pope. They might not have a picture of their own family members because you couldn't have access to a camera, but you had a picture of the Pope in your living room like that. I think he would have been, and there's so many stories about him. You could go on for. Yeah, I actually did a several part series just on him.
Okay. Incredible. That brings us to a close here today. James, I've already shared what I've learned, that the history of the Vatican is certainly not linear. What did you learn?
The history of it is almost as much about politics as it is about religion, if not more so.
It's just such an insane story. I talked to a friend just the other day about it, who's very deep into church history, and probably, I think he knows more than I do. And I mentioned, have you heard of the Cadaver Synod? I'm going to record an episode next week with a couple of guys on the Cadaver Synod. He was like, what? He had never heard of it in his life. Even if you're really not even interested in church history, medieval history, European history, how can you not be interested in somebody getting dug up from their grave and put on trial? Like it's a horror story.
It is a horror story, straight out of Rome, out of the Vatican. And I want to thank you for your time, Steve. And where can people find your podcast?
You can go to my website, A2Z historypage.com, or you can find me on Facebook primarily, but also Instagram at A to Z or Z for our Commonwealth Friends historypage.com.
I would say this is probably the most graphic Putschcast episode we've ever done. Lucky we don't have any smell yet included in this podcast, but we do have visuals now. So we talk about what happened to a man who was underground, slept peacefully, never done anything wrong, and then was put on trial, half rotten, probably covered in maggots, and everyone was clapping along, and he had to defend himself. Yes, that's weird, but that's what the Vatican did in the late 9th century. So make sure you also check out our website on Putschcast, where you find more details. You also find a link to the history of the papacy on our website, and an overview of all our other episodes that we have. And if you've got any questions or feedback, if there's even weirder stories that you're aware of, then please share them with us on putschcast@gmail.com.